I always ask students, who's in charge of your learning success? What do you think most students say?
I would think that most students would point to the teacher. They're the teacher. They're the ones with the knowledge. And I think it's important to help students realize that you are really in charge of your learning success because you never get to the end of this. Students often will say, I'm a bad test taker.
We know that for some learners, the journey is actually what helps the students to be able to get to that end goal.
And I think assessment is a great place to start. What do you want students to be able to demonstrate at the end of this? And then that can dictate how you're showing them or how they're experiencing this material. Hopefully, those new tools and those new technologies, we welcome those into the classroom and we can build a more rigorous curriculum. We can help students prepare for not only what's here now, but for what's the question mark to come in the future.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Learning Success Podcast by Deo Mwano Consultancy. I'm here with my good colleague, David.
Hello.
Bringing you another episode of Learning Success. We are going to be talking about assessment, grading, and what does that look like to be in a process that allows the student's experience to be accounted for, and also the evolution of learning and learning acquisition. What ways do you ensure that evaluations and assessment continues to be part of the learning process?
Yeah, thank you, Deo. I'm really excited about talking about assessment because I think it's a huge piece of the learning process, which I think teachers and students alike separate from those other two pieces, curriculum and instruction. We often think of those, I think, going hand in hand. And then assessment is sort of floating off in some other space of like, well, we get done with all of the curriculum and instruction. And then now all of that's done and the teacher leaves the room and all the students take the test. And I think that, yeah, it should be a more integral part of what we're doing as educators, as learners. And it does look very different in different spaces, different disciplines, though. So it's a huge topic, and it's a difficult topic. It's not one that we're going to solve in an hour here in the podcast. I think it's something that we just need to talk about more because I think it is a big part of the student experience. Students often will say, I'm a bad test taker, or they don't say I'm a bad learner, but they'll just kind of focus on I'm a bad test taker. So they'll be able to sort of focus all of it in that one place, or I bombed the test, whereas we don't look at the other parts, I think, of learning in the same way. It was like, oh, that was fun activity that we did, and I think, yeah, integrating assessments and having them be part of the learning process is really, really important. And I don't think that that's easy. And that's exactly why we should talk about it more, because we should, as educators and learners, see those as positive ways that we can show how much we've learned, because that should be a fun time. A test should be a fun moment. And I think even saying that out loud kind of feels like, oh, that's not what tests are. Tests are hard. Tests are grueling, and I just don't think that that's what they should be. I think that they should be fun. I think we should look forward. Students should look forward to taking the test to say, I just want to show how much I've learned, and it should be so much more positive than it actually is.
In terms of the connection between curriculum, instruction, and assessment, I'm curious, which one has more of an influence on others, right? Because a lot of times when you're designing a course, folks are usually focusing on, okay, what's the end deliverable here, right? Where at times it's really two things, right? One is the experience of this class. Most of the content will be new information where students have to really, acquire the new knowledge and then be able to demonstrate it. Or is this an experience where some students have already had basic knowledge around these contexts or formulas or whatever the course is, and then the demonstration is really more about how they're analyzing through the process. But I think it really comes back down to that, because whichever one that you put more effort in will determine what the experience is for the students while they're engaging with it. So I'm curious, from your experience, when you've tackled your curriculum design, right, from a learning standpoint, what has had more of a weight? Is it the curriculum? Is it the instruction piece or area, or is it the assessment?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great topic. I think at the beginning of my career, I definitely focused a lot more on curriculum and instruction, because that's the piece that I was sort of in control of. And I think as my career progresses and I have more and more experiences and different experiences and being able to teach different students in different ways, I think I focus more and more and more and more on the assessment piece. I'm just thinking of this in real time here, but I think that's why it's so important, is because that assessment piece is really the end goal. I mean, that's what we want. We want students to be able to demonstrate, right? We have curriculum, what the students should know. We have instruction, which is how they're going to experience that or how they're going to acquire that knowledge, the way in which they interact. And then we have assessment, which is how are we as the educators going to, and how are we going to help the students to demonstrate or show that they've actually acquired that knowledge. And isn't that the most important part, is that we've actually reached that? Because we could design a curriculum, here's what you should know. But if at the end the students aren't able to actually reflect and look back and think, this is what I can demonstrate this here, it kind of validates that whole process. And I think honestly, it's a great place to start. That triad model that you mentioned, the CIA, curriculum, instruction, and assessment, I think oftentimes we do think of it as linear, C, then I, then A. And I don't think that it should be like that at all. It should definitely be feeding into, that whole idea of the triad, that they're just three corners of the triangle. And I think assessment is a great place to start. What do you want students to be able to demonstrate at the end of this? And then that can dictate how you're showing them or how they're experiencing this material. And then, thinking of, okay, well, what do I need? What do they need to know? What do I need to show them in order for them to demonstrate that? I think I've done that. I've tweaked the class that I teach, the college class that I teach, calculus. I've tweaked it every semester, and I've been going that way where I think, okay, what do I really want students to know? Going into Calc 2 or going into a career, going on to whatever major that they have. What do I really want them to leave this class knowing and being able to demonstrate and being able to have changed in their minds, the perspective? What new perspective do I want them to have? And then thinking about sort of backwards from there. Okay, what do I need? How do I want them to interact? Because then that changes how much they're talking to each other, or they're just sitting there taking notes, and then going from there and thinking, okay, well, there's a million things to show in calculus. I only have a limited amount of time. So what can I show them that gets to that end? So I think that, in the end, assessment is such a big piece of CIA, and perhaps might be the driver of the whole thing.
So part of the what you're mentioning here is about the kind of the backward model, where you're designing from the end result, and then you're tracking back to figure out what are the experiences that I'm offering in order to get to the end. And then the experience within itself, it's actually what does that look like in terms of the day-to-day thing that you put in place for the students to be able to acquire what they need, so then they can meet the end goal of being able to show what they've learned through the assessment component. So I want to move to the next question here, where we're going to talk about how do you design an assessment to capture not just the knowledge of the students, but also what they've gained in terms of their personal growth throughout the journey. And a lot of times those behaviors are associated to soft skills and, the process of learning, the best way to approach learning, but it's not often being assessed or being captured or being accredited, right? And we know that for some learners, the journey is actually what helps the students to be able to get to that end goal. But everything that's put in place that gets measured is actually the end goal. So I'm curious, how do you measure things like personal growth, determination, perseverance, right, through that process as they're wrestling through to better understand the actual content or the curriculum or the formula. So I'm curious from that, because that takes away from, a lot of times it's like, it's almost backwards here, because in the fitness space, your process is what the trainer puts more emphasis on, right? Like, right. And then they're tracking every single movement that you're doing, because right. They know that the end result is just the culmination of the behavior that's been done over and over, right?
Right.
So in learning is a little bit different, because sometimes, most of the time, it's the end result, which is the grade that you get, or what the deliverable that you've provided, ends up being the factor, and the process itself doesn't really get captured, right? Or doesn't really, it's not rewarded from an educator standpoint. Yeah. So I'm curious, what's your thoughts around that?
Yeah, and thank you for that example of fitness, because I've used that example so many times, that that process of that day-to-day process is so important. I think that there is that emphasis, and perhaps too much emphasis on the acquiring of knowledge, that somehow through this, which maybe that's, I can imagine a course where that would be the sole focus. Mm-hmm. You need to acquire this certain knowledge so that you can get to the end. And certainly there is obviously a certain amount of knowledge that's needed in any discipline. You need to know some basic skills of whatever that might be. But I think that we have to think about what really, in all of this, what is the goal? Is the goal just to acquire knowledge? Because if that is the only goal, then great. You acquire the knowledge, you show that you've acquired the knowledge, and then we're done. But is that really what this experience is all about? Is that the only thing that we're trying to help students to acquire? So, for example, if we're trying to help them acquire problem-solving skills, well, then maybe just asking a question on a piece of paper is not necessarily the best way to help them show that they actually know this skill or feel comfortable being able to problem solve through there. So I think that we want to design things that actually measure what it is that we're trying to measure. Mm-hmm. I think that that's what's important. And if we're trying to, because the learning doesn't stop necessarily, right? As educators, we're hoping that the learning doesn't stop after, the test stops and then, okay, you're done with this topic. Hopefully that's not what happens at all. Hopefully I have students that after the semester is over, they're still thinking about it, and they're thinking, hey, I never thought about it before this, but that just popped into my mind because of something that we had talked about in the class. So we're hoping that learning happens after the test. So I think that all of those skills of problem solving and all of those pieces along the way, we can just build those right into our assessment along with the knowledge. I don't think that it has to be two separate tests. I think that, for example, I guess I'm just thinking of, I've had success in the past of on a test, making it more of an experience that kind of shows like, okay, can you do maybe an easier problem here? And then this one's labeled as more of an advanced problem. And I maybe in advance tell the students that, the goal for, perhaps the goal is not to get the right answer, but maybe you want to get the easy one correct, but I'd like to see how you're working through the harder problem. So I'm assessing their ability not to just get an answer, but actually work through the problem. I know that for an online institution that I worked for, we had to do discussion-based assessments. And those were around a certain question that we had to ask, or that we wanted to ask to see if they had some general knowledge about a certain topic. But it was also a way that we could ask some follow-up questions and say, well, what did you learn through this process? And I found that a discussion is much better. I've asked that question on paper, and students just aren't as able to articulate themselves as having a discussion. But just having a discussion and saying, what did you learn through this process? I think that helps to involve all of those other skills, like you said, those sort of soft skills that are so important in the actual working space of communication, of problem solving. And it gets past just the acquiring of knowledge. Because like I said at the beginning, acquiring knowledge is really important, but just as important is problem solving, is communication, and is reflecting on what you've learned.
Thank you for sharing that. So, many of the trainings that I've done, I always, especially when we're working with students, I always ask students, who's in charge of your learning success? What do you think most students say when I ask that question? Do you think they say their parents are in charge of their learning success, their teacher are, or they are in charge of their learning success?
I would think that most students would point to the teacher, that the teacher is in charge. They're the teacher. They're the ones with the knowledge. And one thing that I try to do with students is help them realize that you never reach a point where you just learned it all. Mm-hmm. And I think that it helps with students when they realize that, because I do have students who, and even well-meaning, I think sometimes students will say the teacher's in charge to kind of get it off themselves. Mm-hmm. But then I think that they'll also a lot of times put it on the teacher, like, I want to learn as much as I possibly can, as if to say, as the teacher, teach me everything you know, mm-hmm. So we can exhaust the list and then I can move on to the next topic. And I think it's important to emphasize, to help students realize that you are really in charge of your learning success, because you never get to the end of this. When I was in the Peace Corps with my wife from 2015 to 2017, and I had that mentality. We went to Ecuador and we were learning Spanish, and I definitely had a mentality where we had a language teacher, and I was thinking, I'm going to learn all the Spanish. Mm-hmm. I'm going to learn everything, and then I'm going to be completely fluent. And I quickly realized that, and I'm an educator. I do this for a living, and I realized, wait, it doesn't work like that. Mm-hmm. Our teacher was not there to teach us everything. Our teacher was there to help us to put things into practice where we could, well beyond the class, well beyond our time in the Peace Corps even, to continue to learn and to continue to develop as learners. And so I think that's an important thing to help students, is that to help them realize that your job as an educator is really to help them to put those processes in place in their own minds to help them to continue to be a learner. And I think viewing assessment through that lens is what can I give the students as an educator that it's not right, that's not, here are the 20 questions that you need to know, and now you've conquered it all. How can we design assessments that help that process, and to maybe you can ask questions about, like, saying, if this were a scenario, what would happen? What would you do? How would you approach this, knowing what you know now? Mm-hmm. And I think things like that will help to transfer that learning success to where it really should be, which is with the learner, and not with teachers or not with parents, because those external sources will go away at whatever point. And the idea is that you've created something new within yourself, a new way of thinking that you can use in a new way, and see the world in a new way.
And the thing about that question is unique is the fact that it doesn't necessarily mean that those who answer one way or another either are students that are successful or students that are not successful. When I do this exercise, I've seen that the answers are all across all different spheres of students. So some students that might be maybe honor roll, straight A's, they might still answer it the same way, versus students that might be, struggling with certain courses. And I think the intersection between that is the fact that it's where the ownership lies around who owns the deliverable in terms of determining if it's effective or not. Right. So with the teacher and the student relationship, it's actually the teacher who's on the other end of grading and reporting out and giving an assessment to determine, evaluating it to determine what you get. Right. So that's only through that lens. But in terms of the acquisition itself and the demonstration of It's definitely the students, and you're the one who's acquiring this information. And so I always tell the students, if we take you outside of the classroom experience, what's something new that you learned recently? So sometimes when I ask that, students are like, it might actually be a keynote that I'm doing or whatever it is. So, students are goofing around and, they don't really want to think about it to provide an answer. So then I would say, when was the last time you learned something on YouTube? Or when's the last time you Googled something? Like, boom, right away. Or say, you learned something on Instagram, on TikTok. Boom, right away. And then they start, I'm like, tell me what you learned. I'm like, oh, there was this thing. Ta-da-da. As they're going, I'm like, yep. And then what did you do with the knowledge? Oh, some said, oh, well, I didn't really do anything with it, but I found it fascinating because for this. Some students might be, oh, I definitely, after that, I then Googled it and then I did this. I'm like, boom. Do you see that there was a direct benefit to you around acquiring that knowledge? There was a connection to what you're passionate about, what you want to accomplish, or just you like having information. So that ownership, we got to be able to find a way to make a connection to what we're learning at school, to who we are. Because if we don't have connection to it, regardless of how well we might be as a student, then that information might not mean anything to us, right? We're not making cross-reference or connection to how this knowledge might benefit us or how we make sense of certain things. And it's always really interesting because, I get opportunity to do these trainings and conversations with all type of students, and I'm able to take them from like a sky high to like all the way down to the ground floor where it's like, what does it mean for you? And it's always really interesting to see that when I do that activity with students. So on the ownership side, it definitely is important to make that connection for the students. And then some students will say, well, it's school, right? Half of this stuff, it's not even usable anyway. Like, why are we learning all this stuff? If it was up to me, I would have this class, that class. All the rest, it doesn't really matter anyway. It's like, okay, tell me more. So, so there is an opportunity there to really find where that intersection lies around ownership, right? Yeah. Because the ownership is on you, the learner. It's almost like it becomes part of you, right? As humans, we absorb so many different things around us, information, and those information kind of shapes how we make sense of who we are, but also how we make sense of the world that's around us. And I think sometimes we minimize that's actually part of humanity that's so cool, that the fact that like we're always evolving, but that evolution happens from what we acquire, right? Like if you think about, over, millions and millions of years, how we've evolved over time around understanding how to handle certain things, deal with certain things, like that has shaped who we are today. So part of that learning acquisition outside of the assessment, it's like that's part of who we are as human beings, Right. So it's interesting. I think there's definitely some opportunity there for teachers to make that connection.
Yeah. Sure.
The other thing that I wanted to talk to you a little bit more is the future of evaluation. I mean, it seems like in this current modern day that we're living in, technology is evolving so fast, and the traditional way that we used to assess stuff, as technology is evolving, might not actually show or get us closer to where the student is, or what the students have acquired, and I think it's really important to have this conversation because a lot of times it takes a really long time for something to be standardized within an education structure. And then once it's standardized, everybody holds on to it and try to protect it because they've made sense of their role based on those standards. But the reality is information and technology is evolving so quickly. So what would you say like the future of assessment and evaluation is or will be, knowing that the evolution of information is like, for the longest time we had to memorize stuff so then, so we can leave a side of our brain retaining all this information. But nowadays it's like you don't need to retain and memorize all the stuff because there's certain tools around us that can do that for us, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you completely rely on the external tools to be where your knowledge base lives, but it's a vessel, right? You get to utilize it. So then you're not leaving some brain space, right?
Yeah.
To be able to think through, because the accessibility of some of these tools, it makes it so much easier to navigate through certain situation or conditions of knowledge and assessment where we don't really need to be memorizing this stuff, right? It's really about how do we utilize it in different situations that we're in. So my question to you is, when we think about the future of evaluation and assessment, what do you see coming? What are areas where you feel like there's an opportunity here? And what are areas that you feel like, ooh, this is going to challenge the status quo and it might really make it harder for certain individual or certain ways that we've done stuff?
Yeah, great question. And I think, I hope that all of this will focus us and make us better educators in the end. I think I was thinking of the example as you were talking. I was thinking of the example of the calculator and how even, a calculator allows us to do so many things very quickly, and things that we can free up our brain space so that our calculator can do that work. A mainstay, I would say, in life, a calculator. All of us, I would think, use a calculator, regularly for whatever purposes that we use it for. But even in classrooms, there are still a lot of classrooms where teachers will say, no calculators. Right. You can't use any calculators. And I think it speaks to what you're saying about that was a skill. I think that was really important. You needed to be able to multiply numbers because you didn't have access maybe to a calculator. Now we have calculators on our phones, which are within my phone's right down there. It's, it's right there for me whenever I would need to use it. I think that that's a really good example because calculators have been around for so long and some of us are so used to them now. I think that other technologies that we have, like AI, math has had a lot of resources around because of just the nature of mathematics, not only calculators, but all sorts of online calculators and graphing utilities. All of those things, I think, have made us better educators and students have had more access to things that they never would have had access to before. And I think using hopefully that as an example, that there are other technologies, like for example, AI is a good one that a lot of people are thinking we need to get that out of classrooms. That doesn't need to be in classrooms because that's cheating and I just don't think that it has to be like that. I think that those technologies, just like the calculator, can make the educational experience much more intense. It can remove barriers that, like for example, going back to calculators, students that have trouble with certain calculations or have certain disabilities, a calculator is a great tool that can get students to get students to kind of be boosted to a level where they couldn't before. And things like text to speech or speech to text or AI, these things can hopefully give students a much richer experience and give a greater amount of students that maybe would not be able to access things before. And I think in terms of assessment, hopefully that we'll be able to use those tools to make that experience so much more richer. And I think a lot of ways it focuses us more on that, like you were saying, the evolution of being able to be problem solvers as humans, to be able to think of a problem and think, would this work? And use all of the resources around you to be able to actually do something. And I think, speaking to students that say, when am I ever going to need to know this? Or this isn't relevant to my life, that hopefully we are able to make those experiences so much more relevant for students by incorporating all of those tools, being able to use YouTube, being able to use all of these technologies to make the experience more incorporated to what students are actually experiencing in life, so that it doesn't feel like school is school. We do these things at school. We don't use AI. We don't use calculators or whatever the case may be. The test is coming, so everyone put away all of their stuff. Whereas in the rest of life, if you had a problem, you'd be like, get out all of the stuff,
right? Because
we need all hands on deck here. We need AI, we need calculators, we need all of this stuff. If you're writing, right? Yeah, let's get everything we can possibly think of. Whereas that experience, that test experience in school is often the opposite. And hopefully we can get more so that those two experiences are one and the same, so that students are seeing, wow, this is incredibly relevant. I'm glad we did that in school, because that's actually something that I'm going to use. I learned more about how to solve another problem. Instead of saying, oh, I did bad on the test, or, oh, we have a test coming up. They're looking forward to that, thinking, I'm going to get to use all of these tools and actually do something that's relevant to my life. I hope that we as educators can be thinking forward, to not think this is something new, I need to get it out of here because we need to keep this, but to think, how is this changing the way that the student is understanding this problem, and how can it help them solve the problem? Make your problems harder. Students have all these tools, so now we get to kind of up the ante and say, well, you have all of these resources, so I get to say, now you get to solve this problem. When I was in school, there's been no way I could figure this out, but you guys can figure it out pretty quickly. Hopefully, those new tools and those new technologies and how things are changing, we welcome those into the classroom, and we can build a more rigorous curriculum, a more rigorous assessment cycle, so that we can help students prepare for not only what's here now, but for what's the question mark to come in the future.
Well, this was awesome, David. I'm so glad we were able to unpack this. For our listeners, please subscribe to our channel and all the different platforms that we're in. We are navigating this evolving world that's changing so rapidly, that finds our learner in a confusing space as they're trying to figure out what it means for them. So it's important to be able to close the gap by showing the students where they have ownership, so they can fully engage in their learning success. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day. See you later.